Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. My name is Dana White, and today we have Tayria Ward, who comes to us live from North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, beautiful place. And I'm going to open it up with a little bit of a ritual. I want to read a poem. I was looking for a poem because I like opening it with a poem. And it was something that I created this morning called Indigenous Ways of Knowing. Our new ways of knowing don't seem to be working. Words frame, build fences around our constructs, push people into clusters of understanding that keep us from learning the languages of interbeing. Our new ways of knowing are becoming ever more familiar as the old forms of wisdom born from ancestry and the anima mundi slip into the past, like a snake's skin, no longer relevant to the seasons. We are adaptive creatures, yet we insulate ourselves from the discomfort of the weather and the inconvenience of life's other forms who express change, complexity, and diversity. We live in the disease of being human, forsaking the mysteries, but finding our way among the privileges of the superior self. We seem to prefer things we understand, that breathe the appearance of life into our new ways of knowing, rather than connecting ourselves to the oneness who is the mother nourishing our existence.
You wrote that?
Yeah.
Wow, it's beautiful.
It was an honor to have you come to us today. And I thought about when you said you would do this, it's just one more chapter in the wonderful legacy of myth salons that my good friend and colleague, Will Lynn, and I had the temerity to have created 4 years ago, and now it's online. And but you said yes, and people are saying yes to this. They show up, they come and they talk. The library of these is just, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful expression of community. So once again, this is a smaller bowl. I know that people have noticed this. I had the big bowl the first time, but I'd like a moment of silence to, wow, it started when we had the coronavirus just taking over the country. Almost 2.5 million people have come down with confirmed cases of the coronavirus. And we're rapidly approaching 125,000 deaths in the country. It's just, it's a travesty. And at least our state is out of control. I think all the states are out of control right now. That it just breaks me up. So let's just do a quick moment of silence, and then I will hand it over to Will, who can introduce the panel, and we'll go to Tayria and have ourselves a myth salon. I'm so deeply honored to be affiliated with everyone who is among us. So welcome, Tayria. Will, how about if you do your thing? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dana. And everyone, Dana White, producer, contributing faculty at Pacifica, co-founder and host of this Myth Salon. And let me go ahead and introduce the rest of the panel as well. My name is Dr. Will Lynn. I chair the General Education Department at Husson College, and I'm also the co-founder and moderator of this Myth Salon. We're joined by Dennis Slattery, author, scholar, poet, and faculty member at Pacifica. Dr. Zaman Stanizai, author, poet, scholar, and faculty member at Pacifica. Dr. Voris Nunley, author, scholar, and philosophy professor at the University of California, Riverside. Dr. Selena Matthews, author and clinical depth psychologist, and Dr. Elizabeth Nelson, author, scholar, and faculty member at Pacifica. And today we're joined by Tayria Ward, is a PhD, lives in Asheville, North Carolina, where she has a private practice offering dream analysis, psychological and spiritual guidance to clients from all over the world. Tayria has worked intensively with her own and other people's dreams for more than 45 years. And for nearly 30 years has been an avid student of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. She's conducted a monthly global community dream symposium since 2017, wherein persons from all over the world come to share their dreams and listen to the collective dreaming minds. So what a wonderful opportunity for us to hear what she may have to say about what dreams are coming through right now and in the world. And we'll talk a good bit about it, but many of you know, one of my goals with this group is to constantly be stretching the drum and keeping the conversation of mythology taught across as many ranges and dynamics of what mythology is as possible. And so tonight we'll be digging deeply into dream and dream consciousness, which is really a wonderful opportunity for us. And with that, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Tayria. And those of you who have been to a Myth Salon before know that the way this is going to go is Tayria is going to introduce some of her thoughts to us for the next somewhere between 20 to 40 minutes. And then we will dive in together as a panel and gradually bring in the audience for more reflection and questions. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Tayria. I look forward to your thoughts tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And it's just an honor to be here among you. I am really grateful for the opportunity to join with former professors and colleagues and friends. So it's lovely to meet you. Let me just say that I finished my doctorate at Pacifica in 2003, finally finished my dissertation and graduated. My subject was reawakening indigenous sensibilities in the Western psyche. And not too long after that, I ended up moving to the mountains of Western North Carolina, where I lived alone in the wilderness for 8 years. And I have sometimes called that my second doctorate, because living in the wilderness alone for that many years is a rigorous practice. And I realize one does these things because I had several dreams that basically were so compelling I had to. But on the other hand, I kind of naively danced into, okay, I'll just go start a retreat center and bring people into the wilderness so that we can think about what the indigenous ways of knowing and being are while we're sitting in the wilderness and not sitting right off the 405 where I had been teaching in Los Angeles. So that was an experiment in life, and I'm telling you, it was quite rigorous, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, physically, in every way. So I feel like I'm coming back to my colleagues with some field notes. It's been a long time. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, and something in me definitely took seriously that the ways of knowing of indigenous people require that. They require an immersion into nature at whatever extent we're able to give it. I gave it a lot. But I knew that if I were to take seriously what I felt called to in this subject, that that would be a way to honor that commitment. So I'm happy to share with you some of my notes. I'm going to just say a little bit about what I mean by the indigenous mind. I got that term, the first place I heard it, I don't know where it originated, but Jürgen Kramer, who used to be a professor at CIIS, I don't know what he's doing currently, but he used that term and wrote very beautifully about it. And I just want to say that to me, the indigenous part of each of us is vital and alive and available and desirous of being connected to. And I also want to say that it is my feeling, my sense that that each one of us is indigenous, that all of our ancestors, I mean, there's a lot now about cultural appropriation and all that, which I think is very important. But I think every person on the planet needs to know that the indigenous mind and the indigenous ways of knowing and being are our deep ancestral history and belong to every single one of us who is alive on this planet. And so it's that mode of thinking about the indigenous ways that I'm thinking about, that which belongs to every single one of us because we live and because we're here on this planet. And as Jung spoke very often about the psyche, it is archaic. It has been around for millions and millions of years. And I think it's interesting to know that that archaic psyche is the actual inheritance that we have just by being incarnated and being human. So I love the saying that he used to say, go to bed at night and ask the 2 million-year-old person inside of you to speak. I always love that. And I would say, ask the 2 billion-year-old person to speak as well, you know, that this ancient archaic part of the self is available and will communicate with us. I mean, it's closer to us than, I mean, it's in us, it's ourselves, it's our breath, that's who we are. And so to revive the ways of connecting with that, the ways of being more conversant with that aspect of the self is, I think, a challenge of this era because it's become imperative that we do. It's like we went off the track in the last several hundred years, and it's time for us to recover who we are because of the pathology that we've created by the destructive presence that we have presented here on the planet, which all of us are very aware of. And I was very interested in Jung's essay called Two Kinds of Thinking. He speaks of directed thinking, which is thinking in words, and it's thinking to produce an outcome. Let me just read his words here. Directed thinking, or as we might also call it, thinking in words, has produced a readjustment of the human mind to which we owe our modern empiricism and techniques. These are absolutely new developments in the history of the world and were unknown to earlier ages. Directed thinking, as we know it today, is more or less a modern acquisition which earlier ages lacked. And he discussed in this essay about the ways that directed thinking, it requires an act of will to be able to use this mode of thinking, and that it's tiring and that it exhausts us. The other mode of thinking is what he called mythological thinking, pre-rational fantasy thinking, and I call it dream thinking. He said it's the mode of thinking that we use in dreams. So that other mode of thinking doesn't exhaust us. It's spontaneous. It gives us energy rather than takes energy from us. It allows us to go into myth and story and image. He did warn us that this mode of thinking is becoming the directed mode of thinking is becoming overdeveloped, and to the loss of this mode of thinking, and that there isn't a possibility that this other mode of thinking could become extinct. And I think that we are seeing that in many ways, that people are even kind of shamed for living with too much availability of the dreaming mind when awake. And Western peoples, or the Aboriginal people, say that Western people have gone insane because we only dream when we're asleep, whereas the Aborigines dream awake, and the dream time to them is a dimension of reality, an ontological realm where they step in and out of dreaming and dream thinking and the dreaming way of mode of being and thinking at will. I mean, and so directed thinking is a tool in the toolbox, but we have made it sort of the one mode of thinking that all of our education, all of our economics, all of our social setup, all of our everything is now directed by directed thinking. And I just encountered not too long ago this book by Michael Pollan, brand new. I think he just published it a few months ago. It's called Caffeine, and I was fascinated. He did quite a study on the plant, the caffeine, and the usage of caffeine in our collective history, which I had no idea. But apparently it only became a global phenomena used in coffee and tea and the other beverages that caffeine is in about the 1600s. And he says by now, he's done quite a bit of research on this. He says by now that caffeine has, that 90% of humans now are basically caffeinated. And he says there's the rise of the use of caffeine in the world has adjusted. He said it's an altered state of consciousness. It is not our natural consciousness. It puts us in an altered state of mind. And he said we've created the world in the last 500 years in this altered state of mind, but we think it's baseline human consciousness because we're also caffeinated. And the world that we have created is based on this directed thinking, caffeinated consciousness. I really wonder what Jung would have thought if he'd seen this research and put together his ideas about directed thinking and when it developed and the modern acquisition of the mind with this plant. So he says that most humans don't even realize that we are thinking in an altered state of mind, that our natural state of mind is lost to us because of this. And basically, he says, caffeine has created the world that we live in. It's this mode and style of thinking, which possibly produced rationalism and the Enlightenment. Who knows how this goes, but it's that mode of thinking that created the world. And now we need the caffeine in order to live in the world that caffeine created. And so it kind of is an endless cycle of, and I think, this is a recent publication and requires, I think, some thought, but I'm wondering, even if we were to discontinue caffeine, which I've tried many times and not successful at generally, but even if we discontinued it, I think that it's hard to live in this world that caffeine created without it, so I don't know that it would even help us at this point. I think we'd all have to figure out, the caffeine is sort of anecdotal here, but I'm just thinking we have to figure out how to live in this world that has been created with some kind of commitment to reclaiming this other aspect of mind, which is available, which I think is imperative at this point, that we figure out how to revive it, this mode of thinking. I want to tell you a dream that I had. This was, I think, I should have looked up the date. Anyway, I think it's sometime in the last year. So I was in bed, just sort of rolling around all night long. And the words eagle and then condor and then eagle and then condor just kept floating into my mind. And I'd wake up and there was one word and there was the other word. And I just kept, so finally it was insistent enough that I wrote it down in the middle of the night and didn't, there was nothing else that came with it. It was just Eagle-Condor. And so the next day, I didn't even know, maybe you all know this, but I didn't even know condor was a word. I thought, what's condor? I did not know. And so I looked it up. And to my great surprise, the Eagle-Condor prophecy, which some of you may know about, is considered the oldest prophecy that we know of. And it's from the Amazon. And apparently these ancient people in the Amazon said in this prophecy that there would be a time when the humans would go two different directions. And one would be the path of rationalism, of, I would say with the language I'm using, directed thinking, this style of being, the technological mechanical sort of mode of being in the world, and that others would go the way of the heart, and think with, I would say this would be the dream thinking path, the way that the indigenous people lived. And he said that the prophecy says that it would be two paths. And the prophecy said that in the fifth Pachacuti, now they divided time into 500-year periods. In the fifth Pachacuti, they said there would be the possibility that the Eagle people would eradicate the Condor people. And if the Eagle people eradicate the ways of knowing, the ways of being, the ways of thinking of the Condor people, that the human enterprise would be over, that we would not survive that. Now, the fifth Pachacuti began in 1490. So it's those 500 years that when the indigenous people, colonization of the indigenous people all over the world began to happen, where, the rationalism, the Enlightenment, all that began to happen, and the Eagle way of knowing, being, and thinking is taking over. And now the possibility of extinguishing that aspect, that way of being on the planet, has really been threatened, and is threatened still, of course. So between 1490 and 1990. So in 1990, they said, the prophecy says, all this came out of my dream, just getting these two words, and I was so interested to discover it. So the prophecy says that if, at the end of this Pachacuti that ended in 1990, if the Eagle people and the Condor people, the Condor is a bird in South America. Eagle is the North American bird. Condor is as significant in South America. So if the Eagle and the Condor people are able then to work together, to fly together in the skies together, if we're able to work together, then we can create the next possibility of how to live in a harmonious way on this planet. So it's not about the Condor people then coming over and eradicating anybody. It's about learning to fly together. So I feel like what this is saying is, this is an imperative. It's been prophesied for a very long time, that if now we're able to bring our rational thinking, directed thinking, along with the dreaming mind and the dream thinking, and fly together in this way, that the great new possibility then opens up to us. It's interesting that the prophecy doesn't say whether we're going to make it or not. It just says, if we learn this, then we will create the next era. If not, we won't survive this. So, and here I want to read this. This is out of Robert Lawler's book, Voices of the First Day. 500 years ago. So I don't know if he was even referencing or knew anything about this prophecy, but anyway, he says, 500 years ago, European colonization initiated the final death blow to archaic consciousness founded in the dreaming. The archaic world perception, its customs, initiations, and languages had held the invisible realms as an essential part of every moment of daily life. I love this. The archaic world perception, its customs, initiations, and languages had held the invisible realms as an essential part of every moment of daily life. This worldview finally sank into an ocean of blood, the genocide of the indigenous people and their way of knowing, of thinking, and of life. And I would say, not only sinking into this ocean of blood as the indigenous people, but that indigenous aspect of our own self, our own, this part of our own being now is threatened for survival. And it's interesting, in my dissertation, I pulled this out of my dissertation. So way back when, I said in the dissertation that this new kind of mind was like a mind virus that the indigenous people had no immunity to. So if we look at it now with us being threatened by this virus that we don't have immunity to, it's just an interesting thought. And I had a recent dream not too long after after the one that I'm telling you, but I tell you, I live by my dreams. My dreams kind of give me the next chapter, the next thing. I am so grateful for them and for my connection to them. But this dream was just about living in two worlds at once, that we have to learn this and that we can and we will. But we have to live in two worlds at once. The dream time is its own realm, its own way of operating, thinking, being. It's very different from the world that we've created, but somehow we're going to find the way to negotiate how to live in that world and this world. I do want to say that neuroscientists now have discovered, you probably are all aware of this, but that in the heart are neurons that resemble those in the head. So that this would, so they are discovering scientifically that the heart is an organ of thinking and perception. And I would say this organ of thinking and perception has been suppressed and colonized just the way the indigenous people and the indigenous mind has been colonized. And so we are not thinking with this, which is one of our, and a very important brain that our anatomy is given to us. And that the heart has its own logics, it has its own way of thinking. Apparently some of these neurons are understood to be non-local, so they can communicate non-locally, they can perceive things that are non-local, so these neurons in our own heart are able to communicate with, who knows, all other parts of this planet, but also the stars and everything else. This is the capacity that we have in our own anatomy here that we have silenced and suppressed in the last 500, 600 years. So, and my fascination with dreams is that everything dreams. We're all, this is our universal language. It's the original universal language, is the language of dreams. Babies dream, animals dream, plants dream, trees dream, insects dream. Everything is dreaming. The earth is dreaming. God is dreaming us. We are dreaming God. Everything is the dream. The dream is everything. And so if we can reclaim this sort of aspect of relating to the world in a very conscious way, not having it be that unconscious thing that when we have to go into sleep to find it. I love this quote of Nietzsche's: "As man now reasons in dreams, so also did everyone reason for thousands of years while awake." And Albert Einstein says, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift." And he also said this, I just ran into this the other day. He said, "I have never made any discovery by logical thinking. All of the knowledge came to me in moments of silence and moments of synchronous insight." So even our great Einstein did not hold up this mode of thinking as the source of his breakthroughs. This story of Jung when he went to Africa, this one just slays me. He conferred with the Laban in Africa and asked them about the dreaming. And he says, this is the response he got. "The Laban answered with tears in his eyes. In the old days, the Labans had dreams and knew whether there was war or sickness or whether rain comes and where the herds should be driven. But since the whites were in Africa, no one dreams anymore. The divine voice which counseled the tribe was no longer needed because the English knew better." And I find that so striking, that their deep connection to the dreaming, just by the presence of the white man, the colonizers, the dreaming stopped, that they weren't able to even access that mode of their own way of life, their own intelligence. And I think if that's what happens with this mode of consciousness that the white man brought, this sort of virus of mind that the white man brought, if that happens to these whole peoples, what does it also say is happening in us? That this mode of consciousness has just shut it down, has just silenced it. And we don't even know it's there. There's some of the, the dimensions of it. And we have no idea. They say that we're using just such a small part of our brain. Certainly we're not using the brain and the heart in the way that we could and must. And I think often of Thomas Berry's, I love him so much, of his saying that we have to reinvent the human at the species level. This is time. We have to, it's like species level, back to the gene, back to the space inside the gene. We have to do that work. And we just simply cannot think our way out of this dilemma that we've created. We can't think our way out of it. It has to be another mode of operating. And he says we need deep cultural therapy. Well, I want to read this quote. Brian Swim, who I just admire so much and was, a student of Thomas Berry's and also a scientist and, great teacher on his own. These are his words. I think our situation is that we are diseased in various ways, not only individually, but as a species, not only as a species, but as a planet. And so what is required is a very deep revivification, a very deep regeneration. We need a new mind. We need a new society. We need a new planet. Other than that, things are fine. I think if the nature of the human mind and the structure of the human psyche is not changed, disaster. If the structure of the industrial society, the institutions and economics are not changed, disaster. If the poisoning of the planet is not changed, disaster. All of this requires our deep and individual response. If you go back into the beginnings, that is where all the creativity is. The movement back to the gene, to the earliest part of life. As time goes on, you get more specialized. Go back behind our cultural roles and self-definitions. Behind all of those, how can we imagine ourselves? How can we listen to the genetic word? How can we listen to that in a fresh, and that isn't in a fresh way, that isn't fixated on some recent stuff? Cultural ideas that have been around for 6,000 years. That's so recent. We've got to go back 2 million years. We've got to go back 20 billion years. See my point? That is what is required, I think. That is out of his lectures on Canticle to the Cosmos. So I'm going to skip all this that I might have said about David Bohm.
I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit on David Bohm.
Okay.
Yeah, don't mean to abbreviate or shorten you. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time, and we have until 7 to get through panel conversation and group questions or whatever. So, yeah,
Right.
and truncate anything.
Okay, all right, good. David Bohm, who is known by some as the father of quantum physics. He has a book called Thought as a System that I really highly recommend. He really dives into the nature of thought itself, and that thought itself is a substance in our matter. That we think of it as some ethereal thing, but it actually is something. He says thought thinks us, we don't think thought. So that's the, it runs us, and we think it's our own minds that are producing these whatever thoughts go through it. But he says it's the way the world is structured. It's a system that is thinking us, and if we can understand that, then we can learn how to work with thought as a system and be able to think our own thoughts, and also to listen to thoughts. He says that we defend our thinking with the instincts of the jungle, because we think that we are what we think, but we're not what we think. We're something other than that. Our thoughts are not us, but we become so identified with it. He saw scientists, he said, who would defend to the death their thinking, even when the thinking was proven to be invalid, but they were so identified with it that they could not let it go. So he he talked very much about how thought works in the brain, and that it changes chemicals in the brain, and that we become addicted to our thoughts. He says the thoughts that are familiar to us, that we develop and that are familiar to us, produce a substance like morphine in the brain, so that we're literally addicted to those familiar thoughts. And that when something comes to challenge our ways of thinking, the levels drop, and you become like the addict who is having a panic attack, who is going into anxiety and sweats and all that, that we can't, it's very hard for us to handle the challenges to our thinking. So he developed a system called dialogue, which I used to teach, about how to understand the nature of thought and how to be able to work with learning how to express our thought, but also have it challenged, and listen deeply in a way that that we begin to understand the chemistry of it. Now, he said that most of science refers to a bipartite structure of how things are, the bipartite structure, which is energy and matter. He said he developed this idea, which says that it's not a bipartite structure, it's a tripartite structure. And the third aspect is meaning. And he says meaning is an actual substance also that affects energy and affects matter. So if you apply new meaning, if you develop new meaning, if in the dialogue process, you're able to open up and create new sense of meaning, that meaning will actually change our brains and our brain structure, and allow for a new possibility of thought. He says, deep change of meaning creates a change in the deep material structure of the brain. The meanings we hold are fixed into the brain chemistry and construction. If the brain holds the old meanings, then it cannot change its state. The mental and the physical are one. We could say that living as we do, we probably have a great deal of subtle brain damage. In other words, the brain is damaged at a subtle level that might not show up at the cellular level, but is deep in the implicate order. Eventually, of course, it shows up in the cellular level too. So a cosmology that is holding the meaning of this mechanistic worldview that we have developed in the last few hundred years, it is set in our brain structure now, and it's hard to think outside of it. And so we have to get into the process of being able to allow ourselves to go through the processes that are like an addict overcoming the chemical addiction that we have. If we are able to develop new meaning, developing new meaning is a creative act. So if we get into this conversation with one another and are able to develop these other modes of thinking and being and operate in those ways together and develop the meaning around that, the brain can change its structure and must change its structure for us to be able to survive this possibility. So it requires, as Brian Swim said, our deep and individual response to all of this. So now I'll go to the part that's I just want to muse a little bit about how do we develop dream thinking. And one of the images, I heard this from an Indigenous elder musing sometime, and I'm not sure what the elder was saying, but it has stuck with me. Just thinking about a cat who is sitting out in the wilds, and I was in the Serengeti and I was in the Masai Mara, and I'd see these cats and they'd sit under a tree for maybe, I don't know, 24 hours, 48 hours. They're just sitting under that tree. And what are they thinking? What are they doing? You know what? It feels like those cats are completely alert, completely conscious. So it's like, what is that aspect of us that has that awareness? And I'm going to say, I have a 4-year-old grandson who is like the love of my life. And I am learning so much from him. And I feel like, I was thinking this the other day, where Jesus said, unless you become as a little child, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And I'm starting to get it, that he's saying these children who come in fresh out of that other world, they have so much to teach us. And if we can let and stop training them so hard to get into this mode of being that we think is going to be their success in this world that we've created, but allow them to be who they are and learn from them, they can show us a lot about what it means in dream thinking. And I can see Stokely, my little grandson, out in my backyard playing for like 2 hours at a time with some little dirt and rocks, and completely fascinated with what he's doing. And I just know that's, he's developing mythic thinking. This is, you know, he's got this whole world created. And he can tell you about it. It's interesting, my daughter said to him once, he was telling a story, and she said, now, is this a dream or is this real? And he said, it's a real dream. He said, it's the real world of dream. So it's like, to him, that was a silly question. And he's had some amazing dreams. And this boy, talk about mythic thinking, and this being the myth salon, here's a myth that he came up, which I think is fascinating. He went to my younger daughter's home in Colorado. She lives in Colorado. My older daughter and Stokely live here in Asheville, to my great good fortune. And so he was at my daughter's house in Colorado, and he had this dream that Arlene, my younger daughter, was at Nana's house, my house. So Arlene was at my house in his dream, and a big tomato came and smashed her on the chin. And the tomato came from Ceres, the dwarf planet Ceres, which astrologers will tell you has very serious, interesting, important energies it gives us on this planet. I don't know that part, but he does somehow. He said the tomato came from Ceres and smacked her on the chin. And I thought, when they told me that he'd had this dream at Arlene's house, that she was at my house and got smacked, I thought he just got the whole myth of her life. Because while she was living with me, after my ex-husband had left the house, and my older daughter had gone off to college, she got smacked. The universe smacked this girl hard. She got type 1 diabetes. She figured out she was gay and didn't tell anybody for a couple of years or more. And her parents were divorced, and just the tragedy of her life around the loss of that family unit and so forth. So she got really smacked while she was living with me, and my grandson has this dream that tells him the whole story. And I need to look at what Ceres was doing during that time. What does this planet that he picked up have to do with that? But somehow I just felt like he's not going to have that dream at his mom's house because she wasn't there. He had the dream at her house. So there's something about the dreaming mind that is so alert to even the environment where it is picking up the dreams. And I have noticed that when I sleep outside, that especially if I sleep outside in another state, I start picking up the history of the land right out of the land. I pick up stories and images and people right up out of the land. So the places that we go and what we dream there, I think that's worth really respecting, that it has some historic information for us. That's just fascinating. So when I was living out on the mountain for 8 years, I spent 8 or 9 months of the year sleeping outside. I had a little screened in porch, so it kept the rain off of me, but I was looking at the clouds and the stars and hearing the owls and the wolves and the coyotes, and just in nature at all times. And so I would say to anybody who's trying to revive the dreaming mind, if you can sleep outside, do it. You know, even if it's just dragging a pillow out onto your front porch, but sleep where the winds and the stars and the elements are much more available to your dreaming mind. And certainly track dreams and pay attention to children. And I've been so fascinated. I feel like this time of COVID that we're experiencing is the moment when we can maybe reclaim some of that time. And I know a lot of people are suggesting now is your time to write your book and do this thing and do that thing and do the other thing and get this done and, you know, repaint the house and do all that. I'm thinking maybe it's really the time to just stop. Isn't nature just kind of stopping everything? And can we just go along with that program and see what happens? You know, what happens if we at least give ourselves appropriate attention to the idea of just stopping it all? I saw a movie with Van Gogh recently, and somebody asked him why he painted, what was his passion for painting, and he said, it's the only time I don't think. I don't think when I'm painting. So he had to have that, and that gave us his art. And I also think of Buckminster Fuller, who was a mentor of mine in my childhood. He decided at some point that he was going to be a failure at this world that is the way it's set up, because he didn't kind of respect it, I guess. So he went into a period of silence for 2 years to unthink everything he'd been taught to think. So for 2 years, he was supported in unthinking. So I would say, let's, you know, give ourselves the opportunity and the possibility of stopping thinking, don't think, unthink, and open our minds to what this other aspect of mind has to offer to us that doesn't think in words and that doesn't have an agenda and that is just awake like that cat is awake, and like that child is awake when he's playing out there forever. He's just awake. He's like that cat. He's picking up the whole world. He's tuned into everything, absolutely everything. I just don't even want to approach him because it seems so sacred what he's doing. So I just revere that he can do it, and I take his lead. There's some people in New York who've started the apparitions of Mary. I've always had a fascination with Mary, the mother of Jesus, those apparitions. I've gone to those sites and always studied them. I've been so interested, and there's some people in New York. A man had the apparition happen in 2011, and he and his wife wrote a book about, she continues to give messages. And the wife said they wrote a book called The Way of the Rose. It's quite fascinating. But the wife said, as she's taking down what the lady is saying, she says these words. Sometimes as I wrote, because she's like the scribe, I had the sense of my mind being reconfigured to accommodate some new way of thinking, or maybe an old way long forgotten by our species that Our Lady was teaching us again. And then also they'd gotten, last September, before all this COVID thing happened, they got a message from her that the streets would be bare, every place would be empty, complete prophecy about all that was going to happen. And in that message, she said, the changes to come will disrupt your way of life, but they will be a greater disruption to your way of thinking. It is your way of seeing and understanding the world and your place in it that must undergo the most profound transformation. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, responses, questions.
Will,
Really?
why don't you jump in?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for moving us through that material and this conversation in a way that's probably more directed than is even, what the subject matter itself is really pointing to.
Right.
So I hope, first of all, I hope we all have activated dreams tonight. One thing I'll just share before inviting everybody else in is just that part you're talking about meaning and the rewiring of the brain around meaning was really interesting to me. have a history of seizures. And my first, I had seizures for couple years, and I always thought that it started. There was a night before my first seizure. I won't go into the whole story of it, but basically had been wrestling with meaning, existential meaning in a big way, and then had come to decide that I thought I knew what the purpose was. I wanted to build my modality and my being around, and it's continued to be. But the very next day I started having seizures. And I've always thought that literally after the realigning around a clarity of meaning was a trigger for my whole brain to start rewiring itself. But I had never heard anything like the idea that there actually are studies that meaning is one of the things that can trigger reworking of the nervous system. So that was revelatory to me. Thank you.
Well, you know, if you can find the thought as a system, he talks a lot about that. That might be really interesting for you to explore his thoughts about it.
Thank you. I'm writing that down.
Yeah, Thought as a System by David Bohm.
Yeah, anybody else who wants to jump in? Thank you.
Tayria, I am deeply appreciative of the kind of emphasis that you bring to this particular, the topic, the Myth Salon, but also the whole idea that we have to overcome our frames of language references and the ways in which we've been, in a sense, programmed to be a certain way that now the program is writing us. And these sorts of ways of being are, in a way, very difficult to unknow. We're not taught the skills of deconstruction as much as we are taught how to construct and how to put things together. And so I'm honored that you would come in here and validate, particularly the Aboriginals and their dream time. One of my first dogs was named Xabo. I may not be pronouncing it correct, but Xhabbo, which in Aboriginal is dream. And it came out of a book by Lawrence Vanderpost, who was a Jungian. And it was really a way of approaching the world through the lens of complete engagement, so that our engagement forms and informs us as a kind of a language, and it has a participation in it that language can never do, because language shields us. Language puts up some sort of an interpretive barrier through which we either hear or we project, but it becomes the way that we know. So I want to validate the way that you're talking about experiencing. I mean, it's tremendously useful, particularly today.
Yeah, I appreciate all your thoughts on that. And I would say that, you know, the deconstruction that you're talking about is pathologized, medicated. You know, it's like when we start to deconstruct, we're not holding together the reality that other people need for us to hold together for them. So they need us to fix us, or they need us to fix ourselves. But it is very challenging to others to go through that deconstruction, and to ourselves, certainly.
So, yeah, that was just terrific, just terrific. And I have 3.5 pages of notes that I'm happy to share with you, Tayria. You know, in the 5 days that I was in the hospital, I had the most grotesque dreams. This is all before the surgery. And they were so powerful, I couldn't write them down. I just remembered them. They kept me up. And they were all around the same theme of a thug or thugs after me. And each night, that motif was taken up in another narrative format. But the vividness of them was what just surprised me. The energy that the dreams had, mixing with the antibiotics, mixing with the world of being hospitalized, that my guess is all of you have experienced in one form or another. But I hope this is okay, what I'm going to do here, because in anticipating your presentation, I went back to an essay of mine that's entitled Mythopoiesis, the shared ground of psyche's dreaming and poetic impulse. And it's a fairly lengthy article because I have toyed with the way that reading literary classics is a form of dreaming. And if one can enter the passages, which is why I love reading passages aloud in the classroom and then working them and being worked by them, then that rational kind of figuring it out gets muted sufficiently that I think the imaginal self is allowed to have some stage presence. So in the spirit of that, I want to read part of a paragraph to you all. And I'd love for you, Tayria, to respond, or to any of the members, because this nexus between the poetic image and the dream image has just fascinated me for years. So here's what I write. What dream images and poetic images share is a mimetic impulse to capture psychic energy in the imagery and to reproduce by means of the power of analogy a reality that appears perhaps to be other, but in fact is another face, physiology, and frame of ourselves in metaphoric guise. Perhaps an expression of the supreme fiction of a self. A dream is thus a mimetic model, a reproduction carrying the force and energy of its own reality that is germane to our further development as an individual. This power derives from the mythos in the psyche that guides, arranges, and shapes its contours, its underlying and energy directing poiesis. And then I'll finish. As Michael Taussig, I don't know if I may be mispronouncing his last name, suggests in his fine study, Mimesis and Alterity, mimesis is an imperfect reproduction, yet it acquires the power of the original, even in its imperfection. The task, he goes on to say, to which the mimetic faculty is here set is to capture the very same spirit power. Your presentation resonated in so many levels for me with regard to this passage that I wanted to share it. I wanted to share it with all of you, and I'm interested in any response you'd like to make towards it.
Well, first response is I would love to have it to read and really reflect on if I could
I
get
know.
it. Do you mind? I would love that. I would love that. But I just felt like I was walking around in the dream time with you. It's like that you're seeing the reality at that, in that sort of dimension of our actual world, another dimension of the world, this mimesis and the poiesis and the images there. It's like they're all so real in that dimension that to me seems like the dream, the dreaming is the dream time. That's what we're talking about, is the absolute utter reality of that whole imaginal realm. That, the dream time and the imaginal realm, I don't know what the distinguishing things are there. There may be some, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But I love that. I felt like I was taking a stroll with you in that dimension, and that you make it so real and available and visible and able to be seen. Like, I just really appreciated that.
Yes, thank you. the cross-referencing between the poetic image and dream image makes me surmise, it's the best I can do, that they're coming from the same place in the same place in the unconscious, both collective and personal. And I can't draw lines between those two either. But there's some. Is this part? I'm just thinking out loud here. Is this maybe another way of speaking about the archaic mind or the archaic unconscious, that art, poetry, dream, this is where they're percolating, and then they're given a shape, you know, in a making or shaping way, but the original impulse, the original energy of the image is from this shared reservoir that you beautifully.
I had a dream once, and the dream was just these words: the heart thinks in images. And that's, you know, what I think of. It's just, that's how the heart thinks. These images are, that's the heart thinking. And that's what that's the dream thinking that you're doing there, is
Yes.
thinking in images.
Yes.
Well, Tayria,
Great.
doesn't it
Yes.
seem also that the head thinks in time and the heart thinks in wholes? And as we move ourselves into a atemporal way of being, such that we, like a kairos experience, we move out of chronos, we move out of the head into the heart, and we allow ourselves to tap into the worlds that exist beyond our temporal frames of reference. And this is useful because I think healing comes from the whole. And it's when we separate ourselves and we fall into temporal references, then we can see the archaic reference. But the archaic is all time at once. And it doesn't know how to exist in the past except when we see it through the present.
Yeah, I don't think the heart thinks in time or space. I think it has,
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, really good point. And I'll say this, you know, when my little professor Stokely, when I'm with him, time doesn't exist. It really doesn't. You know, there's a piece of my mind over here that can sort of track that dinner's going to be whenever it's going to be, and that, you know, that is able to stay connected necessarily to, but time is not there. It's another thing. That's why I say get yourself a 2 to 4 year old, and, you know, let that little being, or a number of them, teach you. You know, really respect that they've got ways of knowing that we've forgotten. So, yeah.
We have a comment from one of our panelists. Elizabeth, would you go? I don't know. We're waiting to wake up the panel and get everybody out there and do it. I've got a couple people out in the wings who want to come in and play with us. And
well, I think I'm in the dream time. There you go. But actually, I had a comment to Dennis and also to Tayria, maybe tying something together, and then as a prelude to the question that I have. You know, my sense is that what is common in dream and poesis is the image, and maybe the image is atemporal. You know, I'm not sure about that. But my sense is that when we really dwell with images, either in our art making, our poetry, or in working with dream, as you're doing, Tayria, that the image becomes more itself the more time we give it. It takes on a kind of a concreteness or a vividness or which lends this in dream work. Maybe you could comment on this, is that sometimes there's this idea that I'm supposed to just tell the dream as exactly as I remembered it, but in dwelling with the images, it changes. The images change.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that with your work.
With how images change, is that what the question?
Yeah. As you work with a client with their dreams, how just dwelling with the dream, certain images come forward or change shape or become more vivid, or some recede. I don't know if you notice that in your dream work.
I do, and it's that's why I feel like dream work with someone is so helpful, because often I'll find the images in their dreams that they kind of skip over, and as soon as I mention that, it becomes almost central. It's amazing how that happens. They change and shift in that kind of way, and just the maybe suggestion of something that their waking mind has described, a certain image in the dream, and you kind of can tell the difference of whether their waking mind has applied this description, and if you go into the dream, you can get a little bit of a different sense of what that image really is about, and kind of work with that, and then they can see it so differently as well. It's like the images there, it's such a, I think, a challenge to say, as we all know, purely with what the dream is offering to us without applying, how it translates itself into our waking consciousness. That's, there's a challenge there, but it's possible. It really, you can get sort of drop that a little bit and get in there. And that's what I really enjoyed doing. And it often changes the nature of the image, and as well as rearranges the images by the other reflecting consciousness that we can offer to someone in their, in their discussion of their dreams. So
here's my question, and I think this might even be a question for you, Dennis, or for all of the writers in the group. In that essay by Jung, Two Kinds of Thinking, he talks about directed thinking as language, intending to communicate to another, and associative thinking is something, undirected, etc., imaginative. But I've often had the feeling that when I'm writing, a sentence or a paragraph or an essay, that even though that's directed thinking in the sense that I'm writing for a reader, the language is also dreaming. And it's dreaming by showing me images in terms of metaphors that show up in the writing that aren't anything that I consciously crafted.
mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm saying is I wonder whether writing is both directed thinking and the language itself is dreaming itself onto the page. And what we end up producing is sort of a blend of both.
I'd love to hear Dennis's and any of your thoughts on that one.
You've all had the experience, I know, of writing something, poetry or prose, it doesn't matter, and putting it away for some period of time, the longer the better, and then pulling it out and reading it. Now, this has been my experience, but I don't think I'm an anomaly here at all. I hear my voice, but I hear the voice of something, one else. And I think that's the voice of psyche or the voice of the unconscious. This is, I hope, touching base a bit with Elizabeth, who with Joe Coppin has written so beautifully on the art and craft of writing. That otherness is there all the time, but there's something about giving time between one's writing something and then rereading it 6 months later, a period of time. And especially if one reads it aloud, one can feel that other voice wanting to be heard, wanting to be recognized. Yeah, so that's been my experience, and I don't think it's it's unusual. Yeah.
You know, Selena, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, no, I have a whole other question I'd like to talk about, or where I wanted to go. And I wanted to thank you for your beautiful, heartfelt, insightful discussion. I'm a clinician, and COVID has brought up so many issues about meaning and what is the meaning of their lives? What is the meaning of everything that is going on? And with a lot of, so that's one piece. The other piece is a lot of my clients dream, and I have a percentage of clients that are elderly. And what I have noticed that I have not ever experienced before is the number of people that are having visitations of people who have been deceased. And this is not common. I've been practicing for over 20 years. But the number of visitations, and I don't quite know where to put all this, because there's so many that are having this. And I'm wondering, with all your dream work, if you could perhaps speak to this.
Oh, wow. I'm really moved by that. I'm moved to hear that. That impacts me to hear that. I just love knowing that. So thank you for sharing that. You know, my sense is that this COVID experience is the earth itself dismantling the veil, you know, between, you know, it's the structures, everything is all getting dismantled. I think there's a rising consciousness of the dream time, maybe, of, you know, of other dimensions of our reality now that are breaking through and breaking in and breaking down and presenting. So it doesn't surprise me that the veil is very thin for people to be experiencing visitations such as that. It doesn't surprise me at all. I find it very moving. And I feel so, I do a monthly global dream symposium, and it's quite fascinating when we listen to people from various continents all over the globe, and the coherence of the images that are arising. It's like this whole, and this helps one to see when you put it together like that, that the dreams in some way aren't even personal. They're just like, it's a rising collective mind that is expressing itself through us in our dreams. And so I think that's so beautiful that your clients are getting new meaning. It's coming out of, you know, this deep reservoir of consciousness that is now more available because of the dramatic situation that we find ourselves in. I'm really moved to hear that.
I hope part of what it's saying is that we're not alone.
What?
I hope part of what it's saying is that we're not alone as we go through the hardest things.
Absolutely. I mean, when has there ever been something that's so global that you probably couldn't find another individual on the planet that everybody you ask, how are you doing now, no matter what continent they're in, they know what you're asking.
Yeah.
How are you doing with this? You know, it's like we're all going through this together. You know, and everyone has a different experience of it, but basically it's the same experience at the root. So,
and I saw Boris down there. Boris, did you have something to add or jump in with?
Thanks, Will, for looking out for me, and then I appreciate it. I like I'm very much moved by your notion of directed. I know it's not your notion, but you're talking about directed and kind of mythological thinking. And what I want to try to do is connect that to indigeneity. The reason for that is I noticed that our paradigm for talking about dreams is visual. But there are other societies where dreaming isn't visual, it's body. It's about the body. It's about the senses, right? Our interest in the visual dates back to Plato, so I get it. And I'm not critiquing it, but I like how indigeneity causes us to rethink what the nature of a dream is, right? So, for example, in the so-called Zulu culture, they understand that therapy can only be done in relationship to another person, that you don't even exist. You can even talk about wholeness if it's not a relationship to another person. So I'm bringing that up just to say, is there another paradigm that we can use to think about? Because you talked about being out in the land, that you're on a mountain, and that's not just about the visual. That's about a lot of other kinds of senses. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. I feel like our body is dreaming all the time. If we can tune into that, then we know we're dreaming, right? The body itself is having a dream. And if we're listening to it at that level, then we can tune into the dreaming that each cell is having.
I mean, think of it this way. I've been keeping up with the chat, and there's a lot of interesting talk and discussion about artists. Well, I know musicians who dream, but it's not through images, right? They don't need an image to get to where they're going. As a matter of fact, they would argue that an image gets in the way of the kind of dreaming they're interested in. So that's why I'm bringing it up. And I want to make it clear, I'm not dismissing what you're saying at all. This is really fascinating. I'm just thinking, is there another way to think otherwise?
To think otherwise about the dream, you mean? Is that what you're saying?
Well, again, there are people in indigenous cultures and musicians who talk about images. They don't even talk about images because images get in the way, but yet they can go to the same place without the use of images. And so that fascinated me when you're out on the mountain, you talked about it, I could feel it, right? I couldn't understand the image, but I could feel your being there. And that's a different kind of dreaming, I think.
Absolutely, right. You know, it reminds me of, where I sort of started with Jung's wording of the psyche is archaic. And I think the dream takes us into that archaic consciousness. And that consciousness is connected to who we were before this earth was even created. That there's there was no imagery of earth or body or story or anything, but there was consciousness and there was intentionality, I think. There was a reason to travel here, arrive here, become, part of this dance we're doing here. But that, that part of our being we connect with in the dream that has nothing to do with the images that are created by the world that we've arrived on.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, right? And it makes me think, like, I think it was Isadora Duncan or a choreographer who said, if I could read it or have an image of it, I wouldn't dance it. Right? They're getting into something else that the images can't do, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. That's really important.
There's something there I'd love to build off of what Dennis had said about mimesis, and I'd just love to suggest that mimesis is not only is it not limited to the visual form, it's not limited to any sense in and of itself either. If I go do do do, you know, you hear the upness. I've given you direction and sound, right? I love synesthesia. Synesthesia is when we start to see mimesis cross the boundaries of different sensory expression, and then we start to realize. I think part of what Dennis was getting at is just like what the mimetics sets up an opportunity to project. And I think you had that great line, right? That it's imperfection, but with full force. Something that's mimetic is imperfect representation of the image, but it comes with a full force. And so I'm just really interested in the way that we can project psyche into any pattern, anywhere, cross senses, cross, you know, senses I don't even have yet, probably, you know. And I feel like that's what, you know, dreams don't limit us to any one sense at all, you know. But I do think, I think what Dennis is saying is about mimesis is really insightful and really interesting, you know, that this relationship between self and anything we want to project into as a reflective communication with ourselves to explore ourselves through ourselves in our own projected reflections.
I love that. You know, there's a man named Michael Cohen. He's started a project of research and says that we have 53 senses, not 5 senses, but 53 senses. And he's doing a lot of research and exploring, and he gets people out in nature that, you know, like, for example, one of the ones I sort of think is interesting is the sense that somebody's looking at you. You can't see them, but you know that you're being, you know, that somebody's looking at you. I'm sure we've all had that experience. That's one of the senses. So there's like 53 of them that have been explored. And I feel like dream thinking is about, you know, opening up our panoply of beautiful, you know, sensing that we can be more conscious of and work with a little more creatively.
I like, Will, that you connected it back to Dennis, because it helps me. You know, Dennis thoughtfully argued, right, that by definition, representation falls short. Right? So we all understand that Yahweh falls short, that even God can't be represented, right? So this is a recent notion. So now I can be more clear. What I'm getting at is, what would it mean that if someone comes to your office and they have a dream and you ask them, instead of what they saw, what did they hear in the dream? What did the dream do to their bodies, right? And that's a different kind of question than what the image can come up with. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think Dennis and Will are onto something that's vitally important about that which goes beyond representation. Isn't that one could argue that's part of God or the divine or the self? Does that make sense to you, Dennis? Or are you thinking?
Yeah, no, this is just terrific. I'm just taking all this in. The body is such an interesting I beg your pardon. The body is such an interesting locus from which to imagine. In other words, the body is a body imagining, always, it seems to me. And mimesis is one corridor by which it can express that imagining. But it's all the senses. And Tara, thinking about 53 different awarenesses is really quite exciting to think about. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest that maybe this is a good opportunity to break through to the audience that we have. Sheila has a question. Are you there, Sheila?
I am. I'm here. I'm here audially.
Great, you are.
Yeah. I'm springboarding off of Tayria's quote of Swim when he said we have to go back to the original, we have to get to the cellular, we have to get the genetic. Tayria, I was at your place several years ago with my husband. I don't know if you remember, but hi, it's good to be with you.
Oh, yes, I do, Sheila.
Yeah,
You came out to the mountain when I lived on the mountain.
exactly.
Ah.
I have, I want to suggest that this idea of indigenousness applies, and I heard you about appropriation, but I believe that we are all indigenous in the sense that we are nature and that we were in our womb, the womb environment. That was our primary expression of indigenousness. And from a pre and perinatal psychology standpoint, they are talking about, David Chamberlain writes about the senses. Francis Mott, in the last century, had a beautiful book called The Mythology of Prenatal Life. And he's talking about the skin having sense, and the way Chamberlain talks about how vibration comes into the bone. So yes, it is talking about literally as we are forming ourselves and making a body, prenates dream and they have consciousness. So I think this, I think it was Hannah Strack talked about the spirituality of the prenate, that when they hear the mother's voice outside, it's the voice of God. I think so much has to do with so much of what wants to come up. I'm writing more about the prenate, the pre-verbal poet, the poet wanting to write, but doesn't have word yet. Bruce Lipton, cellular biologist, said the prenate hears the, they listen and they hear, but it's as if hearing the music without the words. So it's sound, it's image. There's research that shows that a prenate can be aware of what the mother was wearing while they were in utero. So there's something with this heart intelligence too, Tayria,
Yes.
that can see.
Mm-hmm.
There are brain cells, brain-like cells in the gut too. And we function, we develop in 4 developmental stages: conception, implantation, forming a heart, and forming a body. We do it all before we have a cognitively functioning brain. And consciousness is there from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So I do think if we go back to our own indigenousness, that we never lose, because van der Waal says, he's an embryologist that I've been studying, says, we never stop being embryo. And to be able to reclaim that and function and springboard from that and do the condor heart thinking from that, I think we're going to do it. I think we can do it.
I like that optimism. I love that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. I think we can do it too. Yeah, and I think, I have a number of clients who remember clearly things that they were aware of when they were in the womb. That consciousness is still very available. You probably do, Selena, too. Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Yeah. I mean, it just makes so much sense, and they are already developing this awareness that can be reconnected to, right?
See also Zaman, do you want to add to that or jump in a little bit?
I don't know if I can jump, but I have been very, very distracted by this presentation, which was wonderful, but there were so many synchronistic occurrences in my own life that matched with, like if not every paragraph, every other paragraph in her notes that Tayria would say that. So I said, wait a minute, I had this experience, I had that experience and all that. But so there is a whole lot of that. That's why I was kind of weaving in and out, not that I was losing my concentration on it, but just trying to find out, like, there were times in my life when I thought, I had gone insane, and now I found some validity in that. One particular experience I had was I was at the Ibn Arabi Society annual gathering at Berkeley several years back, maybe 2004 or 5, somewhere then. And the night before I was going to present something, I was wondering, like thinking with myself, what would I be saying or what things I should include and all the rest that I'm sure we all had the experience of. And I just got up and wrote something, and I didn't know what it was. But when I read it the next morning, it was basically a dialogue between me and thought, where the thought was claiming that who was I to claim it to be mine, which was, for some of you who have been in my class, I made it part of the, in Omar Khayyam's tent, that dialogue between thought and imagination, the whole thing. So I think that it's part of the human ego of claiming things, that things belong to us because we experience it at a certain time, and we forget that it might be the other way around, that it's not that we can claim it, but we don't, it doesn't even belong to us. We belong to them. But in that case, I think, I mean, there were several other comments, the one on the neurons of the heart, that the Quran talks about it very openly. That's the thinking and the knowing heart. And some modern time rationalist Muslims were saying, like, well, if there was anything in the Quran that I doubted, I would look at this one. How could you think with your heart?
Oh, interesting.
The concept of the senses. The Sufis always believed in 10 senses, 5 external and 5 internal, that our beingness was basically a bridge between those two. And we could turn either way, inwards or outwards, and use that particular set of the senses. The concept of what Dennis brought up between poetry and consciousness in Arabic, they have the same, in etymology, it has the same root. The word for poetry and the word for consciousness. One is shair, one is shu'ur. Basically the same spelling with the one vowel or diacritic mark differences. So I think in that sense, we have been awakened, or probably reawakened, I don't know, the nth time, into an understanding that we are a part of an environment, that our environmental consciousness is a lot more important, that we feel it, we live it, we experience it, we be in it, but not necessarily to own it, or even worse, quote unquote, to develop it, and all the other terminologies we use with, where we basically mess up things. I don't have anything particular to say other than the fact that there were probably about 10 incidences where my life experience had been pretty much the same as if Tayria's notes were, she was reading from my notes, basically. So I tremendously enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those reflections. And that makes me feel like probably what I was talking about is very much in the collective, that, you know, that it would touch you in those personal ways, because it's all, you know, it's part of what we're all experiencing. And I love that it was so activating of your connection to those things. So thank you for it.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate all your thoughts. You might be interested to read Bohm's on dialogue, because he talks a lot about thought in there. And if you were having that dialogue with thought itself, okay. He has a little book, and it's just the transcriptions of some of his lectures about dialogue, the dialogue process. If you can get a copy of that, you might love that, since you.
I copied down from the chat line. I think there were 2 websites given there. So
good.
I'll be pretty busy on that front for the next few days.
Here's an important thinker. He and Buckminster Fuller, I feel like they both were way ahead of their times, and I think people are ready now to pick up on more on what they had to say now. It was, 50 years ago, we weren't ready yet, but I think their time is more here now. So I like to highlight their work and, inspire us to pay more attention to it.
I've got a kind of a different direction of a question, and that is, do you think that it's possible that the eagle and condor consciousness can be part of each other's becoming? Like, can they reinforce each other in some kind of positive or growing way, or are they kind of inherently at odds with one another? What can you just speak a little bit more to how you think those two modalities relate to each other?
I love that question. It's that prophecy and just the idea of it is so sort of descriptive of our dualism, right? Of the duality nature of the the world, the setup and the world that we live in. So I think it's here we are, male and female, directed thinking and dream thinking, eagle and condor. I don't know. I think it's everything is all one thing anyway, right? I mean, everything is, we're all just in the fabric of everything that is. So in that sense, certainly they correspond with one another completely. But there is this I wonder if we can get there. I wonder if that's part of what's going to arise now, is the way that they're not different from one another. Like I'm saying, go ahead, please.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I'm just interested, like Bohm, he's a quantum physicist, right? And part of what he's getting into is wave dynamics and kind of some different modalities, some different ways that matter interacts with itself than was the focus of physics before that time. And
right.
Logic and consciousness was so, Aristotelian logic is so grounded. Western logic is Aristotelian logic, is basically a translation of materialistic atomism into a logic system. It's the same, one thing can't be in two places at one time. Two things can't be, two truths can't be, it's the same, right? So when you change the physics that we're modeling our logic after, do we come up with some different type of reason that doesn't normally look like eagle consciousness, but it's not irrational necessarily either? Like, what is wave consciousness different than particle consciousness or particle rationality or something like that? Waves gives us harmonizing and resonating and, these different words that we prefer to describe a lot of dream consciousness, to this caused this bounced off of that or triggered, anyway, so I don't know where I'm going with it. I'm just really curious and interested in how consciousness can continue to evolve, and how, like you're saying, the two might, the differences between them might dissolve in some ways as we, go deeper into both.
Right. As they fly together, maybe they'll be, part of one another in a more unitive way.
Somebody asked about the images. Our images, our writing systems used to be a combination of the written word and imagery, right? Hieroglyphics, imagery, and the word, right? So they activated both hemispheres of the brain in a way different way than the imageless words do now. And of course, good poets are activating the imagery anyway, because they're participating in that imagery. But it is really interesting to think how our written word has started to integrate emojis and all kinds of different images.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Yeah, since you brought up hieroglyphics, I have an interesting little story about the people on the mountain. When I lived out in the wilderness, there were people across the mountain who are, I think it's one of the last indigenous tribes, is the mountain people. They are not interested in modernity. They're not applying for anything modernity. That's why a lot of them don't have teeth, because they're not going in there. They're just, they have their own ways. And there was this young girl who, when I met her, was like 17 or 18. She'd never learned to read or write. but she knew Egyptian hieroglyphics. She could read them. And her mother was able to verify that she was actually reading the meaning of the hieroglyphics. And I asked her about it. She said, I learned in my dreams. It's all there. She knew how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics from her dreams and had never learned to read and write our language. You know, I thought, okay, well, this is my study, you know, is like to just understand, because it had not been eradicated, that sort of barrier between her connection to that part of her mind, because we didn't educate it out of her or something. You know, I can't certainly explain that, but I think it's quite fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, and then I saw Dennis too. Thanks, Zaman.
I think at one level, when I look at the Quranic Arabic, there are, yes, it's, you know, phonology and that whole stuff, that part we understand. But there are sometimes certain letters, individual letters, that have such a deep symbolic meaning that is not the case of one particular word, but a whole set of words together that would imply that. For instance, the word Quran begins with the letter Qaf. That's just one letter. But the shape of that letter is like the original symbol for infinity. And therefore, many words that are in the Quran that shows anything that is infinitely old, infinitely deep, and infinitely high. When the concept of infinity is there, those words contain that particular letter there. So we know linguistically that, yes, people were not sitting around a kind of a table to say, okay, let's design a language like this, and let's call these words like, you know, this and that and the other. I mean, it must have occurred spontaneously. But now to think about it, like, I mean, for what reason would all these words contain that particular letter, which has the shape of infinity and the meaning of infinity? For instance, the highest peak of the mountain would be called Qulla, has the same sound. The depth of the deepest part of the ocean is called Qar, which contains the same letter. The oldest time, like in eons in the past, would be called Qadim, has the same letter. And so therefore there is a little bit of a symbolic significance of that particular letter that carries the meaning along with whatever the word is. So the etymology gets mixed with the symbolism. There are certain other sets of words. There's the letter Ha, which is the glottal H sound. All the words that contain that letter has something to do with life and with movement, including the word for Hava, Eve, for instance, which gave life. The word for life is Haya, the same thing. The word for wind, which is flowing movement, is Rih. And you keep going on and on like that. And so, yes, Arabic has the system of the 3 consonantal, 4 consonantal things, how you conjugate and play with those. That's one thing. But you can go beyond the 3 consonants. You can go to a single consonant, and you find a chain of words where, like I said in the beginning, it sounds like people sat around the table and designed and wove the meaning into not only the letter, but even the shape of the letter that implies either life, movement, infinity, or things of that nature. So yes, the hieroglyphics would have images there, but here it's reduced even further into a certain shape. I think that can be part of this argument here.
You know, I feel like that's the eagle and the condor together right there, right? They're the, sort of the words and the directed thinking and the dream thinking are all just like woven into exactly how you're describing all that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, but it's things like, for instance, even things that give life, like the womb of a mother, it starts with the same letter. So like at any level, symbolically or otherwise, when there is movement, life-giving, it contains that letter. And yeah, it seems like coincidental, but I don't think that explains it.
but it's almost visual. It's almost like the letter I has a hieroglyphic quality to it, right? We can make all kinds of meaning out of the erectness of the eye and the individuality and all that. And I do think it's interesting. I think that even when you move away from hieroglyphics, you can't take that impulse out of consciousness to want, to see meaning and to bend meaning into even the letters. And I do fantasize about the idea that these languages can have such an internal logic to them beyond my consciousness, but maybe accessible to a savant mind where they do fit together and do make sense, and maybe even accessible to the intuitive savant, even in Appalachia. What an incredible story.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, Dennis, I saw you went off mute a couple times.
Yeah, I wanted to leave space for some others to speak, but I remember reading years ago Boehm's book on creativity, which is the title of the book. And boy, did I wrestle with his understanding of what truly designates something creative and what is maybe a patchwork of shifting things around, but never creating something new out of it. And it was a phenomenal read, and I grasped a fraction of it and need to return to that book because it was so powerful. But, and listening to Zaman with letters and words, I can't help but at least sense that creative impulse in us as a species, and perhaps in all of created order, puts us in touch, Tara, with the archaic mind. I mean, there's something so primal about the impulse to create something, and not out of nothing, but derivatively, out of something that's there, but to reshape and reformat it on such a level that it really is something new, carrying with it something familiar, something traditional. And I wonder what you think about that creative impulse as emanating from the archaic mind.
Are you asking me or?
Yes, and any of the other panelists, but first I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'm fascinated by the question because I'm kind of thinking, if it comes out of that, does it mean it already existed? I feel like creation itself is something that hasn't been there yet. It's so interesting to imagine that creation itself is not patching together other things that already were or other meanings that have already been, but the actual arrival of something absolutely that was not here before. That doesn't go with a lot of the theories of physics at all, but it does actually go with what he says about, what Boehm says about meaning. He said, new meanings. He says, if you get into this kind of conscious dialogue where you're not just beating your thought, but you're opening up your thoughts to create something new meaning is absolutely something that it was never there before. It's a completely creative act. And that changes the brain. That creative act changes the chemistry in our brains. So I don't know, I'm intrigued hearing your riff on that, just wondering, what is creativity? Is it a patchwork of what's already been or an arrival out of the archaic of what was already there? Or is it actually something completely never been here before? I want to read that little book too.
That's an interesting, where we draw the line, where something steps over to, this is new, this is creative and it's new, but I also see real value in I don't know, rearranging parts of reality to resonate a new form of being aware. Let me say it that way. That too has value, and
Yes.
and then we can track that. You know, that volume 15 of Jung's, in which he has 2 essays on psychology and literature, and on the relation of analytical psychology to poetry, is worth the price of the book. It's the thinnest volume of the collected works. But that first essay on psychology and literature, I just think Jung is brilliant about the creative process and the difference between visionary, well, he's speaking about works of fiction, but I think that could be spread further, and psychological fiction. And the first one, or the second one, psychological fiction, there's nothing to be done. It's a baked loaf. It's done. But visionary fiction sends us descending into realms that we never even considered existing. And his language capturing that mystic spiral descent down is just magnificent. And I think it's the best thing he's written, and I don't pretend to have read the whole of the collected works, but on that creative moment when a vision is beginning to be given a form so it can be shared. Yeah.
I'd like to say into the Myth Salon today an appreciation for the body of scholarship that is moving beyond the rational discourse and approach, such that we're hearing more and more talk about analogy, about mimesis, around indigenous thought. Even today, Fiona from Australia mentions a book called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World by Tyson Yunkaporta. And I'm intrigued by the nonlinear aspect of what we've come about here as a field of scholarship that can't exactly fall into, well, we'll go into our bookstore and we'll look in the indigenous section. It just doesn't happen that way. And it's like when we used to look for mythology books, you'd find them in history and literature and psychology. And I mean, they're all over the place. And we're having the opportunity to reinvent how we think and how we process thought and how we communicate with one another. And we're breaking down the walls of these ways of thinking that allow us to kind of move in between these to reach the heart of one another. You know, we're not coming at it through the head. We're coming at it through synesthesia, through feelings, through analogies and mimetic thinking, to, you know, paraphrase Dennis. I think we need to encourage this kind of new thought, new ways of approaching things. And you want to say something for us? I'd welcome your thought. You know I want you to talk. Say something for me.
No, I think you ended it very, very well, and I'm deeply appreciative. I do want to say, returning back to Dennis and the notion of the archaic mind, what I would argue is that what precedes the word in the archaic mind is sound. And a lot we've been talking about is meaning, and John Cage, the avant-garde composer, said that you can't even talk about music if you're talking about meaning, how important sound is. So earlier there was a discussion about ancient text. Well, we understand that the Bible, the Quran, and some other texts were initially, they were oral and they were transferred orally. And it is in that orality and the ritual that they produced a certain kind of meaning. So to talk about the scriptures the way we do now, which is a very modern thing, it's like read an aria and say that we've heard the music. It's not, there's something lacking there. And I think what the archaic mind, and meaning is important, but there's something beyond meaning that's equally important as we think about the archaic mind and transformation of consciousness, that sort of thing.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's good.
Tayria, I would like to invite you to just say a few more words, because first off, everything you're saying is beautiful, resonates with me personally, but it's just, this is rare thought, it's rare perspectives. And if you would just say a few things, then I want to give it to my good friend and colleague, Will. Thank the panel.
I'm going to take that moment and give it to David Wagner, the poet, and read you just a little bit of what he said. It just occurred to me. Somebody mentioned Lawrence Vanderpost. So he'll say the closing thought better than I. This is a poem of his, just part of it, called The Silence of the Stars by David Wagner. When Lawrence Vanderpost one night in the Kalahari Desert told the Bushmen he couldn't hear the stars singing, they didn't believe him. They looked at him half smiling. They examined his face to see whether he was joking or deceiving them. Then two of those small men who plant nothing, who have almost nothing to hunt, who live on almost nothing, and with no one but themselves, led him away from the crackling thorn scrub fire and stood with him under the night sky and listened. One of them whispered, "Do you not hear them now?" And Vanderpost listened, not wanting to disbelieve, but had no answer. No. They walked him slowly, like a sick man, back to the small, dim circle of firelight and told him that they were terribly sorry. And he felt even sorrier for himself and blamed his ancestors for their strange loss of hearing, which was his loss now.
What a beautiful poem.
Makes me cry.
Well, on that, first, let me thank the entire panel. Thank you. I'm deeply appreciative once again for the people who sign up and come and visit us and for what we're able to accomplish here. And then let's have a moment of silence. Let's ring the bell one more time. Thank you, everyone.
Beautiful.
Just a
Beautifully done.
pleasure, just a privilege to be with you all. Just a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tayria.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Night,
Good
everyone.
night.
Good night.
Right.
Good night, folks.